Yeah, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to tonight's event, to tonight's panel, which is part of the Global China Connection Global Summit 2021, which is an event organized by 14 chapters from all around the world. We're really excited and thankful to see so many of you attending, and we're looking forward to tonight a lot. More than ever, it has become essential for the global community to act in concert and face current challenges as one. This year's topic, The Way Forward, Global Collaboration in the Post-Pandemic Era, is about to make a contribution. Tonight's panel is hosted by the GCC chapter at Heidelberg University in Germany and addresses the topic EU-China relations in the new decade. My name is Alessa Mundorf, and I'm one of the board members of GCC Heidelberg for this term, and I will lead you through the evening. Over the past decades, strong ties between China and the EU have developed. The growing dependence on China, as well as its investment activities abroad, raised concerned voices in Europe, and recent media coverage has only fueled the heated discourse even more. The increasing importance of China in the world is causing a global power shift, and therefore it's necessary for the EU to deepen its attitude towards the emerging superpower. We need to ask ourselves, what kind of strategy should we pursue when it comes to China? It's an honor for me to introduce tonight's speakers to you. First of all, we're happy to welcome Professor Carrie Brown, Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London, who will focus on China's space in the international system tonight. And he will be followed by Professor Eberhard Sandschneider, who is Professor of Political Science with a focus on Chinese politics and international relations at Freie Universität Berlin. He's speaking about the current perception of China in the EU and his view on how EU-China relations might develop. We were also hoping to have Andrew Small here tonight, who's a member and policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, but he contacted us today and said that unfortunately, due to health reasons, he wouldn't be able to attend tonight. So yeah, we hope he'll get well soon and there might be more opportunities to collaborate in future events. Nevertheless, given our speaker's experience and expertise in the field of Europe-China relations, we're really honored and happy to have you here tonight. And after the keynote speeches, there will be a discussion between the two speakers. And finally, there'll be a Q&A session with you. So I therefore invite you to ask all of your questions either in the chat or through the Q&A tool. And you can also share your ideas, or if you prefer to speak up by yourself, you could also raise your hand and then we'll unmute you and you'll be able to talk. So now let me welcome our first speaker, Professor Brown. The stage is all yours.
Just to check, how long do you want us to make our opening statements for?
About 10 minutes, but I mean, if you take a little bit longer, that's absolutely fine.
Good. Look, thank you very much. It's good to see my old friend Eberhard. I think last time we were in Beijing about 18 months ago, and who would have thought that we wouldn't have been able to get back to China for over a year. I'm sure, like Eberhard, I used to go to China, 3 or 4 times a year. And now it's a great pity that it's not possible because of COVID. And I think it actually has impacted because the conversations that used to help me, understand what's going on. Yeah, we can do things by Zoom and Teams and other platforms. But I think that kind of real contact is actually a big disadvantage, and it's making a worse situation probably actually worse. So the situation at the moment, I guess, is that after the pandemic, there's obviously been a big public health impact, but also an economic impact. And I suspect that the economics is going to dictate the geopolitics. Certainly, China, as the National People's Congress just made clear, is looking to have 6% growth this year, but I've seen analysis by fairly credible analysts, and they feel that this is going to be quite low, that probably China will get 8%, maybe more, because it's, of course, starting from a low base because of what happened last year. It's probably true, too, that in Europe, because of the devastation in the economy last year, it's going to be growth this year, but growth on, again, a lower basis. There's been a lot of wealth destruction over the last year. And I think that we are going to be in a recession. I think that's pretty obvious. The question is how deep and how long and what the toll will be. Now, I mean, that creates a big, big quandary, which I'll express, I suppose, by saying that on the one hand, China is the solution, on one hand, China is the problem. And our policymakers wrestle with this all the time. On the one hand, of course, engaging with the world, the world's a fifth of the global GDP, which China is, world's second biggest economy and probably quite soon biggest economy. In order to get growth in our own economies, particularly in Europe and in the United States, would be a very, very natural thing. There's, of course, the investment protocol, the CAI, which was agreed in draft late last year. And I believe that has to go through the European Parliament and I think EU member state parliaments in order to be ratified. But I've seen some fairly good analysis saying that there are big concessions on the Chinese side in this agreement. The political environment at the moment means that it has been savagely criticized, and there's a chance that the European Parliament might turn it down. And it'll be interesting to hear Bharat's views on this. So on the one hand, you have these big practical reasons to work with China, climate change with COP26, the climate change conference happening in the UK actually in November. Another very big reason to work with China, with I think a consensus emerging now that the Americans have rejoined the Paris Agreement. The climate change is a absolutely enormous challenge for the whole of humanity, and that China is a key partner in finding, hopefully, some solutions to this massive problem. We also, of course, have China's work with the pandemic. Of course, it's been blamed and lots of angry words said between and with China on this issue. But China has, on the whole, I think with the Xi government, dealt domestically with the issue effectively. It's created its own vaccine, and I believe even countries as critical of China as the Czech Republic are actually using the Chinese vaccine. So this shows you that we are living in a complicated period with very, very big kinds of impulses in the negative and positive direction. On the other hand, we also have to recognize that China has never been a more difficult partner to create a kind of decent dialogue with. I know that last year, in many ways, the agreement between the European Union and China on the investment agreement showed that there could be space for some kinds of cooperation, and that space is very big, and I've just outlined those. On the other hand, I think we have to recognize that the situation in Hong Kong, which today showed a further deterioration, the situation in Xinjiang, the situation between China and the United States, these are not relaxing things. In fact, domestically, of course, our politicians who have been aroused from, at least in the UK, a long period of indifference towards China in many ways, have now suddenly decided that China matters in their lives, and they have acquired a whole new bunch of views about China, and most of those are negative. I think the UK, because it's now left the European Union, is quite an interesting case study because we don't really have strategic ambiguity towards China. I think we have strategic schizophrenia. We are in two minds. On the one hand, we have a prime minister who says, I think he said it twice, very publicly, that he is a Sinophile, that he is a friend of China. He's kind of fond of China. On the other hand, members of his own party, the ruling Conservative Party, the China Research Group, have become increasingly critical of China and created enormous demands over, for instance, possibly having as many as 3 million Hong Kongese move to the UK and have an accelerated pathway to citizenship. This is unprecedented. This offer has never been made ever before. When there was a visa regime and a migration regime in place from I believe, the late 1950s onwards to former members of the British Empire, the Commonwealth. So this is an extraordinary move and an extremely big gesture. But on the other hand, of course, there are important business constituencies in the UK, and I'm sure that's true in Germany, where there are kind of enormous possibilities in China, in finance, in looking at the consumer market there. This interesting idea of the dual circulation, where consumption may rise in China. Of course, foreign enterprises can sell into that. The dream of China market opening, which was always such a strong thing, is now actually becoming maybe a reality. I suppose that really is my conclusion, that it's a strange thing that when the reality of China possibly opening up in ways we never expected is happening, the political impediments to actually taking these opportunities has never been greater. The solution by the United States and Europe, and here there's a strange alignment, is to have this sort of tripartite policy response. And this is something about collaborating where we need to, kind of cooperating where we have to, collaborating where we need to, competing where we must. And I think the final thing is then having conflict where it's necessary. I mean, it's kind of clear that there are this three set of issues. On something like climate change, it's collaboration. On trade, of course, it's competition. And then it's real confrontation on values issues. And this is strangely something that Antony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, said, I think, at the beginning of this month, this idea. But I think it's reflected in language that I found in the EU Commission paper on China and strategic rivalry, issued actually 2 years ago in March 2019. So in effect, we have a multi-dimensional foreign policy response. And the problem with that, of course, is I think it's obviously dealing with the issue, and it's realistic to try and deal with the issue this way. But this means that when we look for kind of clarity with our governments, we are, of course, confronted almost daily with what looks like a lot of disharmony and a lot of, kind of imbalance. It seems very sort of strange that on the one hand, our governments are talking about embracing opportunities with China and trying to go for trade agreements, even free trade agreements, which the UK is talking about. But on the other hand, using the strongest possible language to condemn what is happening in Xinjiang. To me, I guess you have to be very, very strategic in thinking about the costs of overemphasizing one at the expense of others. You can certainly say that the most important thing in our relationship with China is our values, sure. But that has costs in the trade and in cooperation in other areas, because China is perfectly capable of saying that it won't be working with us. I mean, I think, of course, those costs may be worth it. Values is important. I'm not denying that. But we have to be very aware of the costs. The position, finally, I think, is at the moment that we are in this very strange period, because the world is obviously still caught in a kind of trying to deal with the pandemic. There is this lack of, kind of activity. Everything is on an almost like a holding pattern. And so I guess this strange kind of idea that you can condemn China, but also continue to work with China works, because at the moment, nothing is really that real and present. I think as things go forward and these choices become sharper, as the reality of cooperation over climate change, for instance, the reality of the importance of values within our publics in Europe and America becomes more pressing, or the importance of having growth with China so that we have to have a collaborative trade relationship. As these come to the fore, I think they're going to decide this whole issue. So I think we are at the moment in this almost still point in the middle of the whirlwind, but I think the strong winds are going to come to us quite soon. And that's when we'll know of the three things: collaboration, competition, or conflict, which one will prevail, which one will be dominant. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for this insight. And I think before we're going into the discussion and Q&A, we'll first hear Professor Sandschneider, and then we'll go ahead. But to everybody in the audience, if you've got questions already, feel free to already send them to us so that we can collect them. Thank you.
Okay, Elisa, thank you so much. And thank you, Carrie, for setting the stage almost perfectly for our debate on Europe and China. It is no wonder for the two of us that I have no disagreement with what you said, but instead I would like to perhaps elaborate a little bit more on a few of these issues. Let me start with a very general remark. One of the most important effects of Corona in the end, when we have the advantage of hindsight sooner or later, hopefully, will be that this pandemic has been a major accelerating factor for all trends which had been there before and have been accelerated by Corona, including, of course, things like digitalization, for example. The fact that we meet in this format would have been impossible 2 years ago when we last met in Beijing, Carrie. The same is true for the rise of China. And of course, everyone is kind of upset what this means to the international balance of power. And of course, to our trilateral relationship. You mentioned the United States, and of course, watching political changes going on after January 20th, and hopefully continue to go on in a way more acceptable to Europeans, for the time being leaves me skeptical. There is no recognizable change in Biden's China policy compared to Trump. No sanctions lifted. Huawei today, even in a stricter focus on a blacklist of the United States. So conflicts are obviously continuing. And if there's one bipartisan consensus in Washington, then it is the growing criticism of China. And this is moving over to Europe. China bashing seems to be one of the biggest hobbies of our politicians these days, be it the European Parliament or even national parliaments, like, for example, the Dutch Parliament calling events in Xinjiang genocide. Carrie is absolutely right. Dealing with China is a very dimensional aspect. It has many multi-dimensional aspects. It's not only values, it is also economic interests, it is culture, it is creating global goods. We need China if we want to successfully fight climate change. Without China, there's no way. On the other hand, one thing is clear, and that is perhaps our biggest challenge. We will never have a community of values with China. We pretend to have one with the United States, and I underline pretend these days, especially after these 4 years of Donald Trump. But let's accept we do have these transatlantic values, but we certainly do not have common values with China, and we will never have, which is the core challenge for us in Europe and beyond. How to deal with a country with which you do not share values. And values do not allow for compromises. You cannot give away 30% of one value in order to get back 15% of another value. That's not how values work. So it's a real zero-sum game, which is a big challenge. And you have to balance it with economic interests. Germans are being accused, especially, by everyone basically, for stressing too much the aspect of economic dependency and economic interests, balancing them against values and violations of human rights and so on. So this is an open debate, and we will have to find ways to organize our foreign policy according to this multi-dimensionality of foreign policy. That's a big challenge. And one of the core problems in my perspective is that most of our parliamentarians who speak out very loudly and very critically against China, they don't do it in order to change our China policy. They do it because they can rely on the domestic applause. It's re-election and not organizing China policy. And our Chinese friends know that. And they have learned to play with it. And let us just remind ourselves that nothing is growing faster in China than China's national self-confidence, which on the one, to a certain extent, is a very normal process. I keep saying, if you have a country as big as China, growing as China did over 4 decades, you should not be astonished that this country is able to translate economic performance into political power, perhaps even into military power, as we have again seen with the 6.8% growth rate for China's military during the National People's Congress. So that is a normal process, and we will have to learn to deal with it. In my perception, we would perhaps need 3 different steps to organize our China policy in a more coordinated way. And that's following up on what Carrie said. We are absolutely unorganized. We do not have a transatlantic agreement, nor will we get a common transatlantic position on China. I'm pretty sure even under Biden that won't work. Nor do we have a common China policy within Europe. Carrie mentioned the tracks, but add Poland and Hungary and perhaps even Italy. a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, meanwhile, and you see all these differences, and you see the impact of China's vaccine policies and mask policies and all these things, which keep us busy and angry and critical. Europe is not speaking with one voice in so many areas, but certainly not when it comes to a common China policy. So it's easy for China to work with a strategy we call Latin-based divide et impera, divide and rule. It's easy for China, and well, should we blame China? I wouldn't blame China. I would blame the Europeans for not getting their act together. That's important from my perspective. So the 3 steps I would like to suggest first are reduce your angry wording when it comes to dealing with China. This is the aspect of trying to find domestic applause by bashing China. That's not necessary, that's not helpful. And the Chinese are sometimes doing the same, and we have to tell them, give up your bloody wolf warrior diplomat strategy. That's only increasing the cost of China's foreign policy, but not really helpful. We don't accept anything from these guys. So give it up. Reduce the level of aggressiveness in your language, both sides, but also on the European side. Secondly, reduce military symbolism. The Brits are sending a frigate to the South China Sea. The French are sending a submarine to the South China Sea. And even the Germans. We are still thinking about whether to send the frigate Hamburg or the frigate Bavaria. But hopefully it will arrive safely in the area should it be sent there. That's a problem, given the internal military debate in Germany, as you might know. But why are we doing this? Europeans do not have a military strategy in the West Pacific. The United States does. But what can we do? Are we sending 2 frigates to defend the freedom of speech in Hong Kong or what? That's crazy. That's adding a military symbolism, which is perceived as more or less aggressive. In China's perspective, completely unnecessary. That's actionism. Doesn't really help. And finally, I absolutely agree with what Carrie said. We have to learn that we have different levels and different aspects in our mutual relationship with China, which we have to deal with in a different way. Economically speaking, we are, well, China is a big market, at least for the time being. At the same time, it's turning into a formidable competitor for our companies. So we have to deal with it. On the global level, we need cooperation with China. When it comes to values, we have to live up to our own criticism of violations of values and challenge China for that. I have been asked again and again, should we be quiet about Hong Kong and Xinjiang? Of course not. Our Chinese friends have to learn that we do have values which we want to be respected as well as they want theirs to be respected. That will be an issue of continuous debate. And this is what we have to accept, that we will find ways of cooperating, that we will find ways of collaborating, as Carrie said, and we will find ways where the conflicts will go on. It is a multi-dimensional policy. And if we accept that, we might be a major step ahead in a more functionable and workable relationship with China. Always with respect to our friends in the United States, let me finish with this sentence. That's my personal, the greatest concern for me. It's the willingness of the United States to define a China policy which is more and more aggressive. You may have seen this anonymous paper which was published according to the famous long telegram by George Kennan, arguing for containment, for regime change in China, and defining a very aggressive US policy towards China. And our American friends, obviously, even under Biden, or perhaps especially under Biden, expect us Europeans to do more in support of their policy towards China, which is a big challenge for us in Europe. And this is, for me, a great concern that the Trans-Pacific relationship is getting ever more aggressive. And even the debates about Taiwan, let me just say one sentence. This is, in my perspective, a frozen conflict. And whenever you cannot solve a frozen conflict, and no one can do that for the time being, you better keep the conflict frozen. If it's unfreezing, it's getting dangerous. And this is what Mike Pompeo did quite irresponsibly, in my perspective. And this is what the United States and some of our friends in Europe also are obviously willing to do, to raise the Taiwan issue. Don't do it. Leave them alone. Keep the conflict frozen. It is not the situation today or tomorrow to solve this conflict. One of these aspects where we have to find ways to get along with China. Elisa, thank you so much for the time being. I'm looking forward to our debate.
Okay, thanks a lot. And also thank you for elaborating a bit more on these topics and adding some more details. So basically, since today's topic is what kind of strategy should the EU pursue when it comes to China, I was planning to ask you first, like where you see the EU currently between like the two extremes of seeking more engagement on the one hand and also decoupling basically on the other hand. But you kind of already talked about that when saying that we have to find a multidimensional policy approach. So I'll try to incorporate the first question that we got here, which says that there are many divergent opinions in the EU on China. So how do you think the EU should deal with that in order to not make this issue something that can hurt the EU in the long term?
And of course, now that Britain is free of the EU, I think that was the propaganda. Now we're free of the EU. I can take this position of being an observer, and I mean, I think the old issues of, you know, and Eberhard will have a interesting view on this. I mean, you've got a country like Greece, obviously, that has good investment from China and is therefore not that critical. I mean, that's been the case for a number of years. And then you've got a country like the Czech Republic, which has really taken a severe view of China, though, as I said, it's getting, you know, vaccines from China. So it's a sort of complicated thing. Eberhard mentioned Italy and the fact that they've got this MOU about the Belt and Road. And then you've got the kind of major countries, obviously Germany and France, where Merkel has been, as I understand it, and again, I'd be really interested in Eberhard's views on this, fairly kind of savagely criticized for, you know, having this pragmatic approach to China and using pragmatic language when there are some people who think it should be much stronger. Macron last year was getting very, very critical, and it seems that he's gone quieter on this now. I mean, this is very familiar with the thing that I've been watching for 20 years, you know. I mean, the kind of, I remember when I was a diplomat in Beijing in 2001, and we went to the European Commission building, and there was a talk, I think, by one of the negotiators for the World Trade Organization, and he said, you know, the Chinese favorite pastime is inviting Europeans along to come and have a fight in front of them. You know, we would sort of have these battles over, you know, different investment and trade. I don't know whether the kind of investment protocol, if it's passed, will bring, you know, some tangible benefits, and then that might answer some of these problems. But I have to say that these divisions between different member states are deep-seated. I mean, they're not going to disappear. And I think it really depends, again, on who Angela Merkel's successor is. I mean, that's going to be critical, because she, as in many other things, has been fairly consistent. And if you have someone who's going to be a bit more adventurous on China, well, then we're in for a bit of a rocky ride.
Yeah, certainly, I agree. We are all looking, and our Chinese friends are looking to our general elections in September with some concern, expecting perhaps a member of the Green Party to enter the Foreign Office. That would make a big difference, despite the fact that even the present foreign minister has been critical enough of China, to say the least. But Elisa, since you asked for a strategy, the more I think about international relations, the more skeptical I'm getting for the search for a grand strategy. We are living in a very complex world where you have perhaps to learn a little lesson from our Chinese friends, which says, follow the strategy of maximum pragmatism. Things which solve problems should be done. And if you try to follow a grand strategy and the circumstances change, you are ending up with a grand strategy failed. So learning a little bit from China's pragmatism, which can be awfully pragmatic, as you know, is perhaps one of the strategic issues for the European Union. Diversity can be a strength. And in the European Union, we have a tendency of doing everything in all areas at all times together. That is the ideal position. And I could imagine, Carrie, that some of our British friends who voted for Brexit were exactly fed up with this kind of a policy. They didn't want to be overruled by Brussels. And let me say again, it's diversity, which might be a strategy, even in dealing with China. There might be a few European countries who have better access to China's leadership than others do. And those who are, that's why I suggested a rethinking of our wording towards China. If you start calling, I'll just give you the most prominent and sensitive example. If you call the situation in Xinjiang genocide, that is the end of any debate with the Chinese counterpart, full stop. And these issues of sovereignty are non-negotiable in China's perspective. So diversity within Europe can be a strength in that respect, and that would be my answer. Don't try to find one big strategy. As Carrie said, it's collaboration, it's competition, it is conflict, it is all in the same time. And China is a paradox for us in so many ways. It is a communist system creating welfare. That's not in our textbooks. At the same time, it is a competitor, but it's also a partner. It is a rival and a supporter. It is a necessary partner for global issues. It's all at the same time. This is what we have to deal with. And there's certainly no grand strategy. Containment, by the way, addressing our American friends, will never work. It will never work towards a country like China. China is too big, and meanwhile too well emerged into the global economy. China has too many friends all over Africa, all over Latin America, which would be supporting China against any attempt of containment. So these grand strategies, they might exist in theory, but they will not work in practice.
Okay, I see. Thank you. And that actually leads me to my next question. As you said, like this complexity that China is basically everything for the EU, like partner, competitor, everything at the same time. But some scholars and politicians believe that the European Union has to choose sides. Either we stick to our Western ally, so the US, or we try to collaborate more with China. And they believe that there is no way to balance these two options because we're like a small power torn between two superpowers, basically. So what's your take on that?
Well, let me start by just quoting the CEO of a medium-sized company from southern Germany, who a few months ago asked me, what should I do? Should I give up 40% of my turnover on the American market or 40% of my turnover on the Chinese market? What kind of an answer would you give to this man? And 40% of turnover, that's quite a lot. That's a very serious issue for many, many companies. So decoupling is certainly not in the interest of most of our, speaking in a German perspective, our 6,000 companies who are active on the Chinese market. America first, well, China is answering with China first. This dual circulation element in the 14th five-year plan is not only increasing domestic consumption, but also protecting Chinese domestic companies against global competition, which is even more difficult for our companies to make progress or exist on the Chinese market. So the Chinese have their own version of decoupling as well. And one of our economic representatives, when asked to criticize American decoupling strategies, plainly said, but the Chinese started. If you look at what they did to the internet with Google and Facebook and all these things, they started decoupling. It was not the Americans, it was the Chinese. So both sides have a tendency of dividing up the world into two blocks, and we poor Europeans are sitting in between these two giant blocks. It is our core interest not to be forced to choose. You might choose for reasons of values. That is clear. We would, of course, choose the United States. But whether the US is the better partner and the more reliable partner for us in the longer term perspective, that's a big question. And there are many, many people even here in Germany, we know what we owe to the United States. Let me add that. We know what we owe to this country after the Second World War. And I've just been, since in a few days, 25 years ago, a famous American diplomat, George Kennan, died. I looked a little bit in his, well, the two major topics of his life, and one was containing Soviet Russia, but the other one was rebuilding Europe. He closely cooperated with George Marshall in the context of the Marshall Plan. And it seems we have a similar problem today, how to contain China and how at the same time to cooperate with democracies, to rebuild democracies. You know that the American president is thinking in terms of an alliance of democracies. These confrontations, in my perspective, won't really help us in the 21st century. They're dangerous even. Kerry.
Yeah, I mean, a good example, I suppose, of what might, the problems that might happen if you kind of go strongly one side rather than the other is Australia, which, I mean, I was based in Australia for, I think, 3.5 years till 2015. And at that time, I think there was still sort of lots of thinking, you know, with Kevin Rudd and then his successors about, you know, how do we kind of manage this? We're a very big security ally of America, and of course, predominantly a European country in Asia through colonization. And yet their biggest trading partner and their biggest investor since 2010 has been China. And I think you can see now actually a really dramatic deterioration. And I mean, Scott Morrison, the current Prime Minister, has made some sort of, you know, attempts, I think, to kind of soften things, but it's a pretty brittle relationship. And there's a sort of dependence by China up to a point on Australian iron ore, up to a point, but it's looking for alternatives. And I think it will probably find some alternatives. I mean, in Brazil and elsewhere. For Australia, you know, for all the talk about Indo-Pacific, China is the best prospect, and they will be sacrificing a lot. And already this data shows there's been areas where there's been significant drop, you know, in kind of selling of produce to China and things like that. And the public debate on China in Australia is really toxic. If you want to really send your blood pressure through the kind of roof, just sort of, you know, start arguing with some Australian friends about China, and, you know, before you on Twitter, and before you know it, you know, Third World War has broken out. I think it's a big strategic problem because, of course, security partnership. I mean, NATO and America is the absolutely necessary partner. I mean, anyone would be insane to question that. And I think probably, you know, everyone is in this position in Asia. It's a common and long problem, and in Europe, I think it's really starting to hit us. And I think, well, with the UK, you think of something very symbolic like Huawei. You know, I mean, the UK was an outrider on Huawei for a number of years, and, you know, had this sort of investment from Huawei, had lots of cooperation and collaboration with Huawei. And I think if things had been, you know, kind of as they were, for instance, in 2016, maybe before the Trump presidency and then the pandemic, I think the UK would probably have thought and gone with Huawei as a provider of 5G. I mean, what's not to like? You know, it's very comprehensive equipment, technologically, as far as I've been told, very good and cheap. You know, these are things that Britain loves, right? And of course, you know, we've made this statement now that all Huawei components of the sort of any kind of system will need to be got out by 2028. I mean, I think Huawei's got a similar situation in Europe, as far as I understand, and so I think these are the kind of things, these specific things will be where it will be tested, and there will be some fairly sharp choices. The big issue, I think it's almost like a frozen, whatever I said about a frozen conflict. This is like a frozen situation. You can't possibly walk away from either. You just have to kind of sit there and make these tactical moves. You know, okay, we're going to please the Americans by, you know, getting rid of Huawei. But I think also finally we've got to recognize that America, its trade with China has not declined dramatically, right? I mean, it's still a vast partner. And American finance companies like Goldman Sachs are going to China with great enthusiasm. And, you know, I don't think self-interest is so strong here. America is also a very self-interested power. And I mean, it will be taking opportunities I think one of the arguments really about the investment protocol between the EU and China is that it sort of gives the same things in terms of intellectual property protection and sort of subsidies to state-owned enterprises and those kind of things. The first phase of the US-China agreement gave, a year before. It just creates a sort of, kind of equality between the EU and China, despite the very, fierce criticism of the deal in Europe and in America. It does probably similar thing to the one between America and China a year before, which was passed as a great victory. So, there's got to be some kind of equality in this relationship for the EU sometimes too.
Let me perhaps add a concern which is hardly mentioned in these Huawei debates, Carrie, since you mentioned Huawei. I quote a German counterpart who recently looked at me and said, Huawei is a great company. It's perfect technologically. It is cheap, as you said. It is wonderful technology. It's a great company. The only problem is it's Chinese. And if it were not Chinese, we would be wild getting the opportunity in investing into this company. So the fact that Huawei is Chinese, and Mr. Ren Zhongfei in earlier parts of his life worked for the Chinese military, obviously spoiling everything. Let's accept it as it is. And most probably in most European countries, I would assume meanwhile that Huawei will not get access to building 5G. But here comes the problem. Huawei will definitely build, based on its technology, 5G in China within the next 5 years. And if you then start thinking about what 5G means in terms of innovation, in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of all different aspects of modern technology, what kind of a competitor might Chinese companies afterwards be when all this has happened within, again, the next 5 years? That is not in the future, that is tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen. And that is a challenge for us. We will all hopefully live to see. Our younger friends certainly will. Maybe even I will make it to see it. But that is the challenge. So, and let us not forget that our Chinese friends are very transparent and very open when it comes to telling us what their ambitions are. Xi Jinping is absolutely clear in China 2025. He wants to be the leader in 10 major technologies. In 2035, he wants to be one of the big, if not the biggest, but close to the biggest economy in the world. And in 2049, it's China as number one. As Vogel once wrote a book about Japan. Japan is number one, he said, in the 80s. Now it's China as number one. And that's the ambition. And that is the ambition we have to deal with and find ways to deal with. That is the big challenge for all of us.
Thank you. And yeah, now that you brought up Huawei, that's a perfect starting point for another question, because you already mentioned that the issue about Huawei is mainly that it's Chinese, and therefore people are more skeptical towards it than if it would be like a company from Europe or the US or somewhere else. So as it's so urgent, basically, for the European Union to kind of work out their own stance towards China, but there's in the population some sort of fear, basically, when it comes to China, which then manifests itself in China bashing in the politics, as you said before. So how can we tackle this fear in the general public, or how can we even overcome this fear, as this will help to ease our relations with China and maybe make more logical decisions when it comes to that topic?
Well, I have a brief answer, Carrie, if I may. I mentioned this China paradox for us. The simple answer is knowledge would help. But most of our China debate is concentrating on managing our expectations and our views on China, and not reflecting realities in China as they are difficult enough to be perceived. Carrie, we have been making our living on that for years now, trying to understand a little bit more about China. It's not easy. It is much easier to know what kind of values and expectations you have and then blame the Chinese for not meeting them. But why should they meet our expectations? Inviting China, as Bob Zoellick once did, to become a responsible stakeholder is a joke. The Chinese are responsible stakeholders, but they are defining responsibility according to Chinese standards. And why should they define it according to American or European standards? That is the challenge. That's, call it cultural exchange, whatever you call it. Yeah, we have so many wonderful terms, but knowledge, that would be my short answer, would definitely help.
Yeah. So first of all, you know, the sort of rise in racially motivated attacks on people of Asian heritage in America and in Europe and in Britain is just appalling. And so, you know, that's one of the most sort of urgent things to just for politicians to make it clear, which I think some of them have, that this is unacceptable. I mean, it's kind of weird. I kind of half agree with Eberhard on knowledge. However, my experience in Britain is that once we tried to explain a bit more about the EU and people did become knowledgeable, they became far more enthusiastic about voting against it. So I used to sort of feel that knowledge was a good thing, but then, you know, a little knowledge is a problem, and maybe, you know, you need a lot of knowledge really to sort of know, you know, what you don't know, which is the key thing. And you and I, obviously, having looked at China for years, can very happily admit there's so many things that you can't know at the moment with Xi Jinping. There's no you know, real transparency, probably deliberately so. So, I mean, I think, but public education is very important, and these events are important for that. I think also, I'll give you an example. The British Foreign Policy Centre produced a survey of British attitudes towards, well, all of Asia. But the attitudes, this was, I think, done at the end of last year, and it was published only a couple of weeks ago. The one on attitudes towards China was really divided because despite the pandemic and everything, younger people, and that means somewhat flatteringly, people under 55, so hey, I'm young tonight, they had not a very positive view about China, but a positive enough view, and they kind of saw some nuance, and it was, you know, kind of relatively undramatic. Over 55, no, real bad, real deterioration. So now the problem for us is that these are the people that vote, and they'll vote for the Conservative Party. That's the people that really voted last year. Over 55, Brexit supporting. A slight preference. I mean, it seemed that women were slightly more negative towards China than men in this survey, because it kind of gathered that information. I mean, it did show a very big generational difference, though, and I think that's the problem for politicians, because, I mean, I think a lot of them probably do want to kind of give a bit of a more nuanced view and say, look, you know, we've got to work with these people even if we don't agree with them. But I think for the people that vote for them, they want something very clear. And you know, the most passionate people about this issue, with the most negative issue, you know, the ones that will vote, because over 55s vote far more than younger people. These people want to hear negative things, and they're good people to play in front of. It'll probably kind of not surprise you, but Nigel Farage, to my astonishment, said that he was retiring from politics in order to focus on the UK-China relationship. So this is an ominous sign, because I think for populists, this is a very easy target. You know, China is a communist country. There are horrible, murky, and unacceptable racial tinges to this, which we can't ignore. They do come. And my fear is that, you know, if China is more successful, which it will be economically, I think it's going to be more and more successful. We have problems, and I think we will do. I hope they're not too deep, but we're going to have a hard time ahead. This kind of narrative is going to really dig, and I think there's going to be some ugly consequences. We have to remember that the people who've suffered most from this racial antagonism in Europe are either Chinese students who are absolutely innocent, but all being accused of being spies, or people of Chinese or Asian heritage, some of whom are not Chinese at all, and some of whom are as European as you or I. I mean, whose families have been here for generations. So this is something where I think political figures do have to show courage and stand up and say, look, there'll be political issues. We have that with everyone, but this cannot be about, on a racial level, or just because, China is in Asia, we're here. That cannot be acceptable. It's got to be decontaminated from that.
Okay, absolutely, thank you. Well, you already spoke about that Chinese plans and ambitions are usually very clear. So they give off this impression of a lot of confidence. And I'll take this as like I'll answer, or I'll ask to you a question from the audience that says, how may we work with someone as confident as China? And could challenging them, maybe for internal political reasons, be perceived as an insult and cause harm to us in the long run?
Yeah, my answer would be very simple. We have been used to almost every single figure we are getting about China to grow rapidly. And nothing is growing faster than self-confidence in China. It's quite understandable. They have been successful and they hope to continue to be successful. So dealing with them, criticizing them is not the easiest job. My experience is if you try to do like this, like the famous old style teacher would do, you will fail. And that's perhaps even one of the reasons why our Chancellor Merkel is very reluctant in publicly criticizing China. Silent diplomacy can be an interesting instrument, but you have to admit that you then cannot use the domestic advantages of having criticized China. We gave it to them and now we are telling them what to do. If you are trying to move towards silent diplomacy, you may be much more successful. Let me give you one of the most sensitive examples. It is so easy these days to criticize China for the situation in Xinjiang. I'm also criticizing China for the situation in Xinjiang, but not because this is genocide or violating our values. My argument is it is against China's own interests, what the policies in Xinjiang are. And if you take an approach like this, immediately people start listening to you. And very briefly, China had a different strategy towards Xinjiang. It was the so-called Go West strategy. And two major German companies, VW and BASF, built factories in Xinjiang in order to integrate the Uyghurs into China's economic success. And then a really massive series of bloody knife attacks in 2016 changed the policy away from integration to control. And this emphasis on control in a long-term perspective is, of course, in my perspective, extremely detrimental to China's stability interests. And this is an argument people in Beijing do understand. They even if they don't agree with you, they at least listen. And if you take such a perspective, you find listeners on the side of your Chinese counterparts, and that is a much more fruitful, also sometimes frustrating and disappointing strategy, admittedly, but it is much more fruitful than simply blaming China, which is usually the end of the debate.
Yeah, so Britain has been irritating China for nearly 200 years. We are world-class irritating China, and because of the Opium War, because of the annexation of Hong Kong, and I mean, you sort of talking about knowledge again. A British politician, he used to be the leader of the Conservative Party, a guy called Ian Duncan Smith, put a kind of post up a few weeks ago celebrating the 180th anniversary. I think it was the 180th anniversary of the foundation of Hong Kong. And you kind of think, okay, right. So how is this going to help anyone? I mean, Hong Kong is no longer Britain's, and also, yeah, I mean, for China, this was not a happy event, right? I mean, and the kind of national humiliation narrative, whatever one's position on that, it's a very strong feeling in China. And I don't think, you know, British would be very welcoming of sort of, I don't know, you know, a Chinese kind of politician celebrating the, you know, 300th anniversary of Ulster, you know, the creation of Northern Ireland or something. You know, I think there's got to be a sort of sensitivity around these issues, even if we don't agree. I mean, no one likes someone to come along and have big opinions about their domestic situation, even if they don't agree with it themselves. You know, we all have face, I suppose. Everyone has face. I do sort of admit, you know, that China is a sensitive partner. I mean, it's a diplomat, and afterwards, and many other people found this, it can be very sensitive. And that confidence today is quite a new thing. I think under Xi Jinping, there is a national confidence, and I mean, it means that China is a different kind of partner. But as we found with wolf diplomacy, you know, China can get brittle quite quickly. And the problem, of course, is when America also gets brittle and you get this very big escalation. I mean, I think that the only final thing, you know, is that the sort of the kind of importance for people like you know, like me, academics, and Eberhard, and I mean, I think our area has been politicized. I mean, to be honest, it's been politicized. In the past, China was always a difficult issue to deal with. But I think that there was usually, I found in Europe and elsewhere, usually, you know, an audience that would be engaged and kind of interested and curious. And I've now found, you know, because of COVID, that people are much more likely to have strong and critical opinions. And in the past, you know, you would sort of explain, for instance, an issue like Tibet and Xinjiang, you would admit the complexities, you'd also admit the very big injustices, you know, that would be okay. And I think now, you know, it's very common that you get a heavy expectation that you've got to come out and say some, you know, very clear statement. And I mean, it's difficult for an academic, you know, I'm not in the business of politics, and I feel, well, it's okay to say I don't know. I mean, that's my job, you know, to go around saying I don't know, you know. And I think this politicization certainly of, you know, kind of the sinology, and Heidelberg, I know, has a very important sinology department, is a big problem. I mean, the classic sinologists that you get, on the whole, have kept well away from politics, and that's a pity because knowledgeable people need to speak. And I think you can't just get out of this debate and say it's nothing to do with me. On the other hand, people who are willing to speak, I think, sometimes get lured into needing to say very strong statements and perform, you know, kind of these sorts of things. I'll give you one final example. I mean, there's a popular newspaper in the UK, the Daily Mail, and you know, it's quite right wing, and which is, you know, that's its politics. And I remember about 3 years ago, they phoned me and said, you know, can you write an article on China? And I said, yeah, and I said I'd probably write, you know, something about, yeah, there are significant issues, but it's a very necessary partner. I mean, the kind of things I've said tonight. And they said, well, could you not write something, you know, that is very critical and says that it's, you know, the biggest existential threat that, you know, Europeans have ever faced? I kind of said, well, funny enough, no. And so they said, do you know anyone who can? And I kind of think this is the sort of very big problem, that you've got a kind of media narrative sometimes, which is hungry for this kind of analysis. And I think for some, you know, it is very tempting to create a public platform where they're going to get lots of attention if they come out and say what's expected. I don't think that's true of the vast majority of the people in this area, but I do think it's become much more politicized, and the pressure by media and others on people like us who, you know, have covered China for quite a while, to come out with some sort of you know, arranged idea about China just to suit that kind of, you know, narrative is a new feature and is quite worrying.
I see. And now that you've just brought up the media, and also that China obviously is quite sensitive when it comes to certain topics, and that in the past few years there's been this notion of the wolf warrior diplomacy developing, there's another question from the audience that fits really well, which is, to what extent do social media, or maybe media in general, affect China-EU relations? And do you think that the views portrayed on the platforms, for example, in the internet, impact the policies and the measures taken by governments? And how will this influence the relations in the years to come?
So I'll just say something quickly, but I'm sure Eberhard has a view on this. I mean, they're so chaotic and divided that I don't think they could impact on policy. I mean, you'd end up being slightly insane if you kind of looked at the sort of extremes on social media. On the one hand, I mean, you have the most negative and critical voices, of course, which feel that anything about China is evil, and some of them are extremely toxic. Their views, and most of them just are very, very critical. And on the other hand, of course, you have, some of it from the Chinese state media, or kind of, state agents, propaganda. And so, this is such a kind of crazy space that it's hard for a policy. I imagine a policymaker would look at this and not get a very great deal from it. I mean, I think what I've been struck by in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, particularly in the last year, is that in public, I think politicians have to perform, and officials, in a sense, have to go along with the idea of getting tough on China, whatever that means. They say we have to be tough on China. I think in private, there is much more admission. Wow, this is a huge problem. We don't quite know what to do. How can you walk away from your biggest partner? This is not possible. I think they're in a quandary. And I think actually for, policymakers, or those who want to produce ideas, actually, I think there's a hungry audience. I mean, in the European Union, I'm sure in Britain and elsewhere, there is this confusion about, okay, right, we got to kind of say very strongly critical things about, as Eberhard said, Xinjiang and Hong Kong. But on the other hand, I mean, we've got to talk to these people next week about a fundamental issue, about climate change, or dealing with this pandemic, or a trade negotiation that is absolutely a no-brainer for us. So how do you square this circle? And I think actually for those who try and provide some analysis and ideas into that, there is a hungry audience, and that's, a good thing. So I think the froth in social media is very misleading. The people who have to deal with this day by day, they do know the problems, even though they sometimes say strong things in public because that's what they have to do. I think in private, I've been quite struck in America and here in Europe and in China by the fact that people know exactly what the issues are, and they just are trying to work a way through. So that's something positive.
I absolutely agree, Kerry. I'm not sure whether social media do have, I agree, I do have that much of an impact as you just described. It's very, very fast, it's very chaotic, toxic sometimes, but also very positive. The whole spectrum is there. But following up on what you said earlier, general media, one of the problems is there's one job I would never like to do or be forced to do, that is being a correspondent of a German or Western newspaper in Beijing. It's difficult enough to get access to information to start with, but I keep asking our correspondents, why don't you write more objective, quote unquote, or more positive reports? And the answer always is because at home, if I want to be printed, I have to write critical things. People expect at home in the leadership of my newspaper is expecting that I write about human rights violations, about dissidents. So in the end, people believe that dissidents are important in China. My impression is they may be much less important than our media seem to imply. And that is, of course, one of these distorting aspects, which is not helping our China debate. And social media are adding to this, kind of distorted development. But I would agree with Kerry, I don't see that much of an impact on actual policy decision-making coming out of social media.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. I was only thinking earlier today about when I was first dealing with China as a diplomat in 1998. I remember, I think Jiang Zemin came to Britain on a state visit, who was the president of China then. It was 1999. And I remember in the Foreign Office, the media in Britain, they were, absolutely kind of obsessed by two things. What trade deals were going to come out of this visit, and human rights. Was Tony Blair going to raise human rights with Jiang Zemin? And you know, everything was framed on this. And I kind of thought at the time, it seems like, why are you asking these two very different things? But that's all they did want to know. And there wasn't much interest, you know, in sort of the history of the relationship or the new possibilities. It were these two questions. And I don't feel after nearly 25 years, things have moved on. It's a very static story. I mean, either you've got the, you know, kind of the sort of horror story of China, you know, the Guardian and others. I mean, yeah, their reporters are very good, but, you know, they produce this very hard hitting, you know, like the terrible situations here and there in China. Or you've got the, wow, you know, this company went to China and 2 weeks later, they're all billionaires, you know, and let's go and make a load of money. And I mean, it's such a static story. And when you think over that 25 years, China has become, you know, the world's second biggest economy. Chinese people have urbanized, you know, 60% of people now live in cities. You've had wealth creation, you know, for like quadrupled the size of the economy. You've had internet penetration. You've had social change every day. They brought, you know, they created, was it 30,000 kilometers plus of high-speed rail? The place is unrecognizable from what it was in 1998. And yet the media narrative is very static. So that's indicative of something.
Okay, thank you. This perfectly fits to another question of which you partly answered already, I think, because it says, it was said that a lot of the rhetorics concerning China eventually only aim on re-election within Europe. And this person that would like to ask you how this kind of China bashing could become so popular. This you partly answered already. And also where you would basically locate the beginning of this culture of extremely toxic anti-China rhetorics. Do you think there's like a single starting point that you could like pinpoint, or was it rather a slow development?
Yes, there is a starting point. It's June 4th, 1989. You should remember that before that date, the Dalai Lama did not get a visa to the United States. Afterwards, he became Peace Nobel Prize winner. And if you look back into the 1960s, horribly early for many of you, I know, during Maoist times, young Western intellectuals followed Mao and wanted to establish a Maoist type of society here in Western Europe. The Maoist debate was part and parcel of our students' movement in the late 1960s. So we were full of admiration of Chinese communism as one version of world communism. And these were the times, by the way, when human rights were violated in an unbelievable way in China, where people were driven through streets, beaten to death, sent to camps, and. There has been no single stage in China's history in the last 100 years when human rights were more severely violated than during the Cultural Revolution. But Western intellectuals were full of praise. And then all of a sudden, when I started in the early 80s to do university courses on China, there was a big debate among Western China experts whether social change would be possible in a communist system. And Chalmers Johnson, Carrie knows certainly the name, a former colleague from Stanford University, he did a big book on social change in communist systems. And the skeptics were all out there saying there is no way that a communist system can ever change. And throughout the 80s, we were fascinated by these early reform developments in China. And then came 1989, and all of a sudden, the debate rapidly changed because these pictures, which came at the prime time of US TV into our living rooms, that was the deep shock, and that was when it started to become an issue, human rights violations in China. Before that date, there was not even a major human rights institutions, of course, always were critical about the situation in China as well, but the general public was not. And that change came with 1989.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, in the UK, actually, there's been a lot of discussion lately about Sinophobia. And I think the roots are a bit deeper, probably because of Hong Kong, and you know, there were historic links. I think Liverpool had the earliest Chinatown in Europe. going back into the middle of the last century, the 1850s. And yeah, I mean, because of the British Empire, basically, there was, I mean, actually, there's been a lot of rethinking about imperial, legacy. You saw the statue being ripped down of the slave owner Colston in Bristol. And it's interesting that sort of China is on the edge of this discussion because it wasn't a formal part of the empire in the way India was. But it was still an important, an incredibly important place for the empire to sort of, creep in. And Hong Kong, obviously, the story of that is very important. And I'm just sort of struck by how the whole kind of British understanding and discourse on Hong Kong is still slightly overshadowed by that imperial kind of legacy. And the idea that I think people sort of put it almost like we're British, we have amazing values, and you need to kind of, you're an undeveloped country with, these sort of unmodern values. And it's very, I would say, very paternal. And I mean, it's just not caught up with the fundamentally changed reality that China is now a hugely powerful country. And Britain is a relatively, compared to China, I'm just saying compared to China, is not the power it once was. I mean, because China's changed so much. I think actually a friend of mine who dealt with the Hong Kong negotiations made a really good point, and I talked to him about this recently, because he said no one in up to 1997, in that period of negotiation, no one thought that China would change the way that it has in terms of its economic size. It's not that Hong Kong has changed. Hong Kong, yeah, it's changed, but not, dramatically compared to the change in China. I mean, in 1997, China was a smaller economy than Britain's. Now it's, I mean, about 3 or 4 times the size of British economy. And I think this is what has completely sort of upended things. On the issue of Hong Kong, actually, although it's not about Sinophobia, but on the issue of Hong Kong, the problem is that a 50-year agreement after 1997 was signed when China was not the player it is now. And I think in the minds of Chinese leaders, rightly or wrongly, I mean, this is just a sort of observation, they kind of think, do you know what? I mean, why are we sort of, talking about this 50-year deal when actually we're ready, as they showed today, to completely have sovereign ownership over this whole issue. And I think their kind of frustration and their very fierce responses to British complaints is, not so much about the complaints. I think the British complaints are, yeah, I mean, you've got to make those complaints. It's a serious issue. But they're tinged by this feeling of, you were the power that, kind of were so big. And when you were big, this is the treatment we got from you. Now we're the big and powerful one. Could you just not speak to us in the way that, you used to? I think there's a lot of that. And it's got to, I'm not validating the way that China's behaved on Hong Kong, of course, but the psychology of this is pretty easy to read. I don't think China is in the business these days of taking lectures from anyone. I think it has dialogue, and those dialogues are tough. But anyone, like some British politicians who go into meetings with Chinese, and I think one of them said recently, we will tell China when it's wrong, but we will praise it when it's right. No. You can't treat China like a kid in a school. Absolutely no. That mentality is totally gone. It's got to go.
Let me just add that one of our misunderstandings back in those years of negotiating the future of Hong Kong, Carrie, you will remember, was that Hong Kong might be the beginning of fundamental change on the Chinese mainland, and might be the germ injected into China's political system to finally turn it into democracy. Goodness, that was wrong. And we have this wonderful formula of one country, 2 systems. And I think meanwhile, people in Beijing have understood this formula is not showing any attractiveness to people in Taiwan anymore. So give it up as a model and take back Hong Kong for good. This is a matter of national sovereignty. And well, the shock for people in Hong Kong, you might have doubts whether Hong Kong ever was a democracy. People here in Germany keep arguing that China is violating the democracy in Hong Kong. To the best of my knowledge, Hong Kong was a crown colony. And the last governor did introduce a few democratic elements, mostly concentrating on elections in order to anger China, so to speak. But that was certainly not a democracy when it was taken back by China. nor will it be in the future. It will be a regular part of China's area of sovereignty, and that comes difficult for people in Hong Kong. They have, by the way, they had not been asked. The people in Hong Kong had never been asked. It was a negotiation between the British government and the Chinese government. And now people, especially young people, realize that half of this period is over. And they will most probably live long enough to see the end of these 50 years. And what comes then? And why should China extend this one country, two system, well, hybrid element, when maintaining national sovereignty is such a high value for China's leadership, given the history Carrie just mentioned, and the century of humiliation and whatever it is called. And the same applies, of course, to the Taiwan conflict. These are sensitive issues for China's leadership, and they are not willing to compromise. We will have to live with that fact.
Yeah, and I think the pro-democracy groups in Hong Kong, yeah, I mean, it's an impossible situation, but I do think they made a massive strategic mistake in 2014 in rejecting the offer that was on the cards, you know, on the table then of, you know, this sort of hybrid choice of the chief executive where, you know, you had a committee letting 10 candidates through. Yeah, extremely incomplete and not very satisfactory, but at least something, and you get to fight another day. But I mean, once they turned that up, I think the writing was on the wall, and we see the outcome now where I think basically it's all imposed. They had, I think 2014, they had an opportunity to, you know, show some pragmatism and to sort of just, I don't know, compromise for the longer term. And they just walked away and refused, you know, and I think tragically, that was kind of the door shut from that point on.
Now that you brought up the topic of Hong Kong and the keyword of democracy, this brings us back to the topic of our values. And there's a question connected to that here in the chat, which says, we often talked about our values, whatever that might be. But looking at the current situation in places like Poland and Hungary, it seems like in certain point these nations have more in common with China than partners in Western Europe. What do you think are ways to reinforce the values, for example, that we in Germany have, against the oppositions inside the European Union? And do we have any power over China in this regard, considering that Europe is so divided in its values within?
I mean, one good thing that we could do is live up to our values, right? I mean, live up to our values, you know. I mean, I know it's you know, America under Trump, what could have been, so people get very emotional about this. I know, you know, there were very many reasons why Trump was voted in, and I'm not kind of making any condemnation of that. You know, I mean, I'm sure many people voted for him for very rational reasons. But, you know, the tone of politics under him, just the tone, not the policies, was absolutely the worst advert for democracy. And I have to say about our own Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, you know, I mean, though he has, you know, changed in the last year because this pandemic has been such a huge experience. But, you know, the tone of politics under, you know, him initially and with the Brexit debate was just so off-putting. And I think, you know, for many in China who sincerely did look up to America and Europe, I think they've got real questions about, you know, what has happened where you get these sort of tones being used, and then you know you get a lack of performance in certain areas. I think you know, in the past, I think there was a sincere respect for, you know, European values and American democratic values, and I think that has been eroded since 2008 because of the financial crisis in Europe and the problems that caused. And then, of course, in the kind of era of populists, I'm, you know, I'm not attacking the values that Europeans or Americans have. I mean, they've been very important and they're fundamentally important now, but they are under attack like never before. And, you know, it's no good saying, you know, the China model isn't going to sustain itself. It looks pretty robust today. It looks in pretty good shape. We have to believe and implement our values like never before, not talk about them. We have to live them. And we have to speak, in terms of respect and democracy and, the kind of ability to live in a pluralistic society and show it works. Because if we don't, there are alternatives now. And I don't think Chinese will be particularly interested in looking at an alternative which seems to be attacking itself more busily than it's actually kind of trying to defend itself against others.
I absolutely agree. I would just add a little warning concerning one sentence you keep reading and hearing these days. The sentence is, we have to do our best to manage the rise of China. Full stop. Think about it for a moment. We are not in a position, we do not have the power, we do not have the impact to manage anything in China, and certainly not the rise of China. All we can do is, as Gary just said, starting with our values, we can manage ourselves. We can try to be as successful and as efficient as possible and live up to our own values as much as we can. You never export values to other parts of the world, to other political systems. If you are successful, you might have a trickle-down effect. You have a diffusion effect. Values do spread because they are more efficient than other systems of values. This is how our values spread from Europe to the United States and back again. This is how our values were promoted within the transformation period after 1989 into Central and Eastern Europe, with all the blowback which we have seen in Poland and Hungary happening as well. So the most simple answer to that question is no. We have no way of managing China except of managing ourselves in competition, in collaboration, even in conflict with China, as Carrie said at the beginning.
Okay, and then as we still lack a bit in managing ourselves or our common EU strategy, there's another question in the chat, which is, could you elaborate a little bit more on how China views the current EU's foreign policy towards them?
They have a lot of fun with us. Well, first of all, they have a difficulty Carrie might understand, British people might understand, understanding Brussels is not the easiest thing to do. And this also applies to our Chinese friends. They certainly have a preference for doing bilateral business, but here comes a very important aspect. If you look back 20 years, China was very, very careful in entering any multilateral institution. And then in 1995, with the Shanghai Five, later turned into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they started their first initiative. Then came Belt and Road. Now we have RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the biggest free trade zone in the world with 2 billion people involved and 1/3 of the global GDP. China's initiative. So China has turned, has made a multilateral turn, so to speak, because it knows we are big enough, we are important enough and influential enough, we can afford to be members and parts of multilateral events. That is one of these changes we have to deal with. And that also defines China's view of the European Union. There are certain partner states. Germany certainly belongs to one of the most important partners. There are others finding a lot of interest in 17+1, certainly is one of the catchwords here. But otherwise, as I said, China is quite successfully dealing with divided Europe in its own interests. And if you look at the image debate of China during vaccine strategies or fighting COVID-19 strategies, you can see they are pretty much successful to some extent and less successful in other areas. So it's an open race.
No, I have nothing to add to that. That's absolutely agree.
Well, now that we're just talking about Germany, I would like to ask, because someone said, as for Germany, does giving China economic aid give us any advantages or benefits? If we're discussing whether trade from a standpoint of beliefs and values should be intensified or not, shouldn't we ask ourselves what giving money for free to the second biggest economy on earth actually accomplishes?
I will have the great pleasure of letting Eberhard answer this one.
I just wanted to make exactly the opposite suggestion, that you answer it on behalf of me. No, to the best of my knowledge, we stopped giving this. The last figure I know of is 69 million euros developmental aid in the final stage, while China itself was giving 1.3 billion US dollars of developmental aids to African states and Latin American states. So that was a joke, and it has been abolished. And meanwhile, we are not giving developmental aid to China anymore. But foreign direct investment is, of course, an issue. We have been proud of being one of the biggest donors of foreign direct investment into China, and now we are a little bit upset that first the Chinese came with their form of foreign direct investment to Germany and have been reducing these levels of foreign direct investment due to the criticism they are finding here. So meanwhile, it is a more economic and the less developmental policy aspect of cooperation.
Okay, thanks. You just brought up Chinese projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative, or also like trade agreements such as the RCEP. And that brings me to a question which would be a bit more connected to Mr. Small's keynote, actually, but I think I'll still go ahead and ask it, which is, do you think that the EU should like actively pursue partnerships with other Asian countries, such as maybe India or Japan, as they might also be interested in finding new partners now in technology development and so on? Do you think that would be an alternative basically to being torn between the US and China?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is the Indo-Pacific, isn't it? This idea of there being an Indo-Pacific. And for fans of the fantasy novelist J.R.R. Tolkien, you know, the Lord of the Rings, this is like, you know, kind of the fantasy land at the end. You know, you kind of get to this place, and all the way along your journey, people say, oh, look, the Indo-Pacific is just over the hill, just over the hill. And, you know, you keep on going and you never quite get there. I mean, Australia, I think it was Peter Varghese, who was the head of their foreign service about 8 years ago, came up with this idea of the Indo-Pacific, because I think for Australia, they were looking for an alternative. As we can see, as of today, that alternative has not been, you know, kind of forthcoming. They still have a huge dependence on China. And as I said earlier, that's very politically problematic. I've heard that, you know, next week, the UK will be issuing its integrated strategic review, which a colleague of mine, John Bew at King's College, has been working on in the government, you know, for I think about 18 months. And this is meant to be the first comprehensive review of British foreign policy, you know, for a generation. And I've heard that the Indo-Pacific is going to be a big commitment in that. I get, you know, the Americans talking about the Indo-Pacific. I think the assumption is if you would talk about something enough, it will come into existence. But I think the Indo-Pacific, there's two problems. One is it's not a coherent narrative like the Belt and Road. I mean, the Belt and Road has many issues. I'm not denying that, but it does have Chinese money behind it. And some of that money has come out. I mean, probably quite a bit of it. I mean, it's a real thing if you want to engage. And Pakistan is engaged. Sri Lanka has engaged a bit more problematically. You know, there's certainly things you can see. We can all argue about what the Belt and Road is, but, you know, it's, I think, a bit of a more solid idea in our heads. The Indo-Pacific, you know, who's underwriting that? You know, I mean, where's that being run from? The second thing is, well, you know, the issue really is that I think we all hope that India is going to be a great counterbalance to China. There's a couple of big problems with that. The first is that India is a much smaller economy. I think it's a third the size of the Chinese economy. It's growing, but I think it's you know, going to be quite some time before it's remotely, you know, comparable to China's economy. It just doesn't have the infrastructure for a start. The second thing is that India is not a benign political ally too. Under Modi, you know, nationalism has increased. In some ways, it is not as as problematic as China. Its treatment of certain areas in India is deeply problematic, and, you know, attacks on freedom of the press. You know, the fact that it's a democracy, everyone therefore forgives it. You know, a lot of other things, but those other things are becoming pretty severe at the moment. And I think the third thing is that we would really be wishing away the fundamental strategic incompatibility between India and China. We are thinking a lot about the rivalry between China and America. This is a big, big concern. We're thinking a lot about the rivalry between China and partners in the South China Seas. We're thinking a lot about, all of these sort of issues between China and Russia. I think the greatest problem in the region and maybe the world at the moment is the relationship between China and India. It is a very fragile relationship. There's, of course, the border dispute, which is unresolved and will probably always be unresolved. China and India have a very profound strategic rivalry because they are both in each other's territory. And they both have ambitions to be regional superpowers. Basically, they have that aspiration, and they're both very nationalistic. And I suppose the final thing I'll say is very hilariously in China, in the past, I don't know if it's still true, there were 150 Australia study centres, where the Chinese studied Australia. I think a few of them were also, next door to New Zealand study centres, where there were two doors and one room. You went into the same room from these two doors. India study centres, I know of maybe two or three. And when you think about the enormous shared border between India and China, you think about the enormous shared interests, and shared problems. It's very kind of striking that India and China don't seem to want to know a lot about each other and think about each other. They have a kind of almost a resistance. And certainly I think for China, it's way more knowledgeable about America and way more knowledgeable about the European Union than it probably is about India. I think it's got a cultural disdain towards India. And that actually is a big, big problem because India has many problems. It should not be underestimated. So this is I think a very unstable relationship, and one that could be absolutely catastrophic for the region and for each other if it goes wrong.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. My observation is that Indians are constantly comparing themselves with China and always concerned about the fact that China is in each and every aspect, from GDP to Olympic medals, China is always winning. And that adds to the Indian attitude of feeling inferior. But of course, on the economic level, it's true that Asia is bigger than just China, and that we should perhaps diversify. India is part of it, Australia is part of it, but I absolutely agree with Carrie. The Indo-Pacific is not a consolidated region which might come close to being an actor in international relations. That is kind of a dream for all those who are looking for any kind of cooperation, institution, actor, which might help counterbalancing China. That is the big American search these days of finding European partners in containing China or partners in the Indo-Pacific. That could come out as a quite dangerous development. But for the time being, I don't see, even if Joe Biden might be able to organize a World Conference of Democracies after Corona, and even if these people meet in person, it's a nice conference. It's great for all the hotels to get international guests, but that's it. In the end, there will perhaps be a declaration, but when it comes to the substance of political cooperation, I cannot imagine that, given the divergence of interest between all these wonderful democracies, that there is in the end a counterbalancing cooperation against anyone, be it Russia, be it Iran, be it China, any one of the bad boys in international relations these days. So it's kind of a strategic dream and far, far from being a strategic reality. We are agreeing too much, Carrie, eh?
I always would agree with you. I mean, this is my default, I couldn't possibly, I couldn't disagree with you.
Yeah, we're trying our best, but we fail. We keep failing.
That's right. I mean, we needed to have an argument about something.
Still, it's very interesting to hear your views on this, even though you tend to agree. It's still really insightful for us, I think. But looking at the time, I would actually like to ask everybody in the audience, if there's another question, maybe go ahead and ask it now. because I would like to ask a last wrap-up question, basically, which is, I think, Professor Sandschneider, you said before that we should start thinking out of the box and try to look at things a little bit less biased when it comes to China. I think you said that in one of your speeches before.
Yes,
Not
I didn't
tonight,
say it
but
tonight.
yes, not tonight, some other time. And so I would like to ask you what you could give us, which advice you could give us as students to try to think out of the box, and maybe like where could we start to actively take a step back and look at things differently? Would you have any advice to share? Like how can we trick ourselves into thinking out of the box?
Trick yourself. Say trick yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
trick yourself.
I have
maybe
one
step
very
back to the side.
yeah.
Pardon,
I
Gary?
just have one. I mean, I think what we lack is, and we should have a new conceptual framework for dealing with a power where we're not, we say we're not friends, we're not enemies, we're in between, but this isn't very good language. I mean, we need to have a kind of framework of understanding that the Enlightenment, kind of vision of a world run on universal values is not going to come. This is a world where there's going to be two operating systems. When you go onto your laptop and there's Chrome and there's, sort of Microsoft, and some things you can run on Chrome and some things you run on Microsoft. We live with two operating systems on, kind of our computers. We'll have a global system where there are two operating systems. And I think what we're doing is we're moving from a bungalow into a two-story house, right? And there's lots of stairs, and most accidents happen on the stairs. So I tell students, become stairs experts, become, kind of manage the stairs. And I think you will be able to contribute to making this manageable, not solving it. No problem can be solved in this, manageable. That would be my suggestion. Please don't agree with me, Eberhard. Please say that we're moving into a block of flats. We're moving from a bungalow to a block of flats.
That's an interesting metaphor, Kerry. I have a different one. Let me just share my personal experience. I have so many colleagues all over the world, certainly in Germany, who, when they went to China in order to learn the language, were at an age where they find their living partners. Married to a Chinese is one structural element of many of my colleagues. I'm not married to a Chinese, nor did I ever have an awakening moment, a certain book, a film, anything connected with China, which made me so interested in this country that I started to learn Chinese and travel to China. No, my experience was very difficult. I had an academic teacher who was inspiring. Kerry, you might remember Jürgen Domus. I did my PhD with him, I studied with him, and my idea about my future life at the age of mid-20s was, if I start dealing with China, this country is important enough, I might not be unemployed. Until this very day, and meanwhile I'm officially retired, this was true. So it was a very strategic and pragmatic decision. And here comes this multifaceted term, pragmatism, back. Do it the Chinese way. Be as pragmatic in dealing with China as you can. And whatever you seem to believe, to know, be careful, it might be wrong. I remember my first language teacher in Taipei, when my Chinese was good enough that we could start talking to each other. He did not speak one word English, not one word German, just Chinese. The first weeks were horrible. But then he asked me, why do you want to learn Chinese? And I said, very proud, again, as a young man, I said, I want to be a China expert. And this Zhang Laoshi looked at me and said, but you will never understand China. And I asked, why? And he said, because you are not Chinese. And then I said a sentence to him, which has been the red thread of all my work on China ever since. I told him, listen, I don't care. I will never be Chinese, of course not. But I hope to understand enough about China, should I become a job connected with China, that I will not make any major mistake. That has been the philosophy, basically, of my attempt to understand China. And this process has started 40 years ago and still going on. I keep learning different things about this country. It's a huge country. And of course, we are talking about China, China's government, the Chinese. there's no alternative if you want to exchange yourself on China. But never forget, it's a huge country. It's very diversified. It has many, many different facets. And if you just remain open for these different facets, you might be on the right track. That would be my suggestion. Be on the stairs. I like the metaphor, Carrie.
Yes, thanks a lot for that metaphor. I think I will remember it for a long time.
Okay. Don't marry a Chinese or marry a Chinese, whatever you want.
Okay, yeah, well, I would like to thank everybody for attending tonight and for taking part in the discussion and also asking so many questions. And of course, I would also like to thank our speakers, because without you, this panel would not have been possible. And yes, thank you for sharing your experience and expertise and for giving us all these insights into EU-China relations at the moment and in the future. And although our panel tonight is about to end, the GCC Global Summit has just begun. Up until the middle of April, there will be more panels on different topics that all deal with global collaboration in the post-pandemic era. As you can see now, there will be 2 more panels happening tonight, a bit late for us in Europe, maybe more for like the audience in the US. One of them is on US-China relations, and the other one on the future of Asia-Pacific trade. And then on March 19th, there will be another one on technology, and this will keep on going until the end of April. So we hope to see many of you back then in the next panels. And thank you again all for participating, and have a good night. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.